After having spent years in communist secret police prisons, I escaped from East Germany to the West and immigrated to the United States in 1961. Only 2 years later, I had a good engineering position at Hewlett-Packard, despite my poor English and difficulties with the switch to the American measurement system and management style. And when I drove one day through California's Los Altos Hills, looking at its expensive homes, I said to my wife Krista, "Someday I want to have a house like this." When she replied, "You will never make it so far," our relationship developed another crack. Shortly thereafter, Hewlett-Packard decided to shelve my beautifully invented, designed, and executed line of very high-frequency microwave equipment because the market was not yet ready for it. I went into a twilight of uncertainty and became a bit disappointed. None of my designs had ever made it into production. Other people had always made the product development decisions and told me what to do. I promised myself I would learn more about marketing to become more capable of predicting and understanding product developments. During this period, I also became very interested in a book about Schopenhauer's life and philosophy that my friend Usha had given me shortly before I left Germany. While Krista worked night shifts as a scrub nurse in the Redwood City Hospital, or was busy cleaning, doing laundry, cooking, and running errands, I tried to extract Schopenhauer's ideas from page-long German sentences. What fascinated me most was how precisely Schopenhauer had laid down his thoughts, developing a unifying philosophy that included every aspect of life and spirit, physics and metaphysics, art and wisdom, and all by the time he was 30. This book gave me a lot to think about, including the fact that I was past 30 and had accomplished absolutely nothing. I had driven myself hard and was very tired. The factory walls were moving in on me. I knew I had to give my bohemian side some air. I had saved some money, and I could invest half of it in the stock market and use the rest to take a trip. By buying on 50% margin, I hoped to find on my return more money than I had now. I wanted to see Germany again, and I remembered my resolution in political prison to see the entire world, to compensate for the time lost and the good living I had missed by being confined there. A trip around the world sounded like the ultimate compensation. I lived for some time with a world map that I had nailed to the wall and sketched in with a pencil a likely route. This was the only planning that I made before I talked with Krista about letting me go on this adventure. That she would come along was never a question, since there was not enough money to take her along. I would have to travel without concern for comfort. I planned to go through treacherous territory to places I knew only from reading my favorite author, Karl. I would travel off roads tourists never saw. No threat of hardship or harm would scare me away from a region I wished to visit. I was willing to risk my life for this experience. I would go through Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, Africa, Persia, Afghanistan, India, Thailand, and Japan, and then return to San Francisco. I made big posters advertising for somebody brave enough and tough enough to travel with me, and placed them on the billboards at Stanford and at the University of California at Berkeley. Nobody replied. People probably thought I was either crazy or not serious. I would have to go it alone. In March 1963, Hewlett-Packard gave me a 6-month leave of absence for my trip. When I said goodbye to my friends, they worried I might not make it back. One guy, who had always been very friendly and had always had his eye on Krista, said, "I hope you don't come back." He apologized right away, but I knew that was only a clumsy attempt to cover up his Freudian slip. I wondered how he could think that way. To me, other men's wives had always been taboo. Krista brought me to the airport. We hugged and kissed for a long moment, and she cried. I felt bad about leaving her behind, knowing I could have chosen an easier itinerary, or just traveled to Germany with her. But this trip was part of my prison idiosyncrasy, and I felt I needed it to get myself breathing again. Then the farewell was over, and I was seated at the window on the plane to Portugal. It was good to know I could return at any time and have a woman as solid as my wife Krista waiting for me in California. As I flew over my new homeland for the first time, I looked down on the route I had driven with her. I was now glad to be a part of this country, which appeared incredibly big, beautiful, and indomitable from up here. I felt lucky to be setting out without any particular plans, reservations, or time limitations. I could do everything totally spontaneously, finding my path as I traveled. At the end, I hoped to meet Krista for a delayed honeymoon in Hawaii. I enjoyed 2 days in Lisbon, seeing the sights, eating the fine food, drinking the excellent wine, and being served by the superbly trained waiters. I was finally living as I had always wanted to, completely free, with an attitude like Thomas Mann's Felix Krull. The world was mine to enjoy. There were limits, however. I had only about $2,000 with me to keep myself fed for 6 or 8 months, and move myself around the world. With all the sights of the world to feed me, though, I would only need simple transportation and safe places to sleep. I traveled by bus and train to Spain, to some lost places like Badajoz, and to all the famous cities, Seville, Córdoba, Granada, Toledo, Madrid, and Barcelona. What struck me most was that in the little villages and even in the cities, the inhabitants went into the streets at night to stroll, stand in groups talking, or sit in the many cafes and restaurants, socializing with their friends and neighbors. Because mass tourism was not yet common and I had come in the off-season, I was often the only tourist in town. I had conversations with many people, mostly using sign language. Everybody seemed to have enough time for me, with everything being más y menos, more or less. This life was the antidote I needed for my hard-driving life in California. Even though I was just a foreigner passing through, I had more human contact here than back home in Palo Alto. However, I wasn't able to slow down to match Spain's tempo. I had trouble adjusting to the fact that trains or buses did not run as scheduled, and I often raced from site to site, from the bullfight to the Prado, from buses to trains, as if I was still on my old schedule in California. Not even the constant rain slowed me down, so I often got completely soaked. I had started to write a journal for Krista, but I left the first 30 pages on a bus. Then, on the train to Paris, I noticed my camera was missing. I realized I had left it at a restaurant close to the railway station in Barcelona. I could not afford a new camera, and I could not bear the thought of going around the world without taking pictures. From Bordeaux, I took a train back to that restaurant. I left my suitcase with some lawyers on the train who promised to drop it off at my Paris hotel. The restaurant owner handed the camera back to me somewhat reluctantly. I think he had intended to adopt the orphan. I was relieved, but with this detour, the trip from Barcelona to Paris took 33 hours. After traveling inexpensively for 3 weeks in Spain, I was tired when I reached Paris. At first, I found the French and their capital anything but charming. I was also already saturated with impressions of Spain, and concerned about how expensive Paris was. It was still raining, and the Eiffel Tower looked to me like a somewhat outdated gizmo. I was also upset because I didn't have my suitcase. The lawyers had left a note at my hotel telling me the name of their hotel, but I could not decipher that name. I lived without my suitcase for 2 days, worrying about it, until finally they called me once more and I was able to retrieve it. Now I went absolutely crazy visiting the Louvre and Paris's many other museums. The incredibly beautiful paintings of the Impressionists and Van Gogh and the vibrant works of the great modern painters inspired me. They reinforced the wish I had formed in New York to devote part of my future to painting, to trying somehow to get my soul on canvas. From Paris, I traveled to see friends in Mainz who lovingly brought me back to life, even washing and ironing my laundry before sending me on my way. It felt good to be back in Germany. In Frankfurt, I picked up the brand new Volkswagen I had ordered and paid for from California. I planned that it would provide me with inexpensive transportation and shelter. When I had last visited Frankfurt in 1948, everything had been in ruins. One could ride for 10 minutes through the center of town without seeing a single house still standing. The population then seemed to be made up of people cleaning up the rubble, black marketers, returning POWs, and refugees from East Germany. Now I found the town completely rebuilt, with fine stores lining the streets, everything impeccably clean and orderly, and all the people dressed neatly and tastefully. I was so impressed that I decided I would stay only 2 more years in the United States, and then come back home to Germany. I was still having difficulty adjusting to American life. and I had not made much money. I then received a letter from Krista. My stocks had taken a dive, and worse, her father in East Germany had suddenly died. I called her. I told her that she should try to get a visa and visit her mother on her own because I could not go back to East Germany. My mind filled with concern. There was no way to predict how long it would be before the East German authorities decided whether to give her a visa. If she decided to join me on my trip after visiting her mother, I would have to shorten it and leave out the most dangerous parts. As we talked, I was also worrying about the high cost of a phone call from Germany to California. Our conversation was short. International phone calls were not allowed for in my tight budget. Even paying for Krista's trip to Germany might leave me somewhere on my path without enough money to get home. I think I was too greedy to give up any part of my trip, and the whole problem seemed too complicated to solve on the telephone. To this day, I cannot forgive myself for not choosing the simplest and most appropriate solution, cutting short my trip and flying home to give Krista support. Instead, I tried to start an inoculation program against all the possible diseases and infections I might encounter. When one doctor told me that, just to be reasonably well prepared, I would need at least 34 shots over a period of 4 months, I gave up. I did not have time or money for such a regimen, and I feared that all those shots would leave me more dead than alive. My Volkswagen improved my life dramatically. I felt I now had the power and freedom to drive anywhere, and to do anything. I bought extra snow tires for driving through desert sands and high mountain snow, and extra-large water and gas tanks to make me less dependent on water holes and gas stations. When Krista decided not to come with me, I sold the passenger seat. The back of the rear seat just happened to fit into its place next to me and made, together with the back area, a wonderful one-man bed. I ended up sleeping 120 consecutive nights in my Volkswagen. Each night I would just park in front of the finest hotel or the railway station, put sheets of cardboard in all the windows, and sleep safely under the watchful eyes of the hotel staff, or even the police. Once, though, somewhere in Italy, I almost killed myself when I parked on a bridge, not noticing that railroad tracks ran directly beneath it. I woke up in the middle of the night, dizzy and gasping, with a gigantic headache. I was completely engulfed in the thick black smoke rising from a locomotive parked right below me. After several weeks of sightseeing in Austria and Italy, I took an auto ferry through the Strait of Corinth to Athens, where I spent countless hours admiring the ancient Greek and Roman sites I had always wanted to see. One evening, all dressed up and walking the streets of Athens, I noticed that some important event was going on in the French embassy. I walked right past all the security guards into this place. Nobody stopped me, apparently because they thought I was from the Secret Service. Soon I found myself in the main hall where the festivity was being held. I had no idea what I was doing, but in this naive way I shared the air with Charles de Gaulle and the King and Queen of Greece. Not too much later I left as I had come, without incident. From Athens I drove to Istanbul, where at 3 o'clock in the morning some guys began trying to break into my car. When I pointed a tear gas pistol at them, they ran away. I had no idea how dangerous this was. If they had had real guns themselves, they might have shot me. As June ended, I was traveling through Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. I found these countries absolutely magic. I loved the people and the way they dressed, lived, and talked. Life was real here, down to earth, natural. I talked to men out in the fields, in villages, and in the cities. Our communication was mostly with sign language or a few words in German, English, or French, but it worked very well. People everywhere invited me for tea and little things to eat, mostly cookies or melon. I became one of them, sitting in cafes or just on a sack of beans in the stores, smoking the water pipe. Each time they realized I was German, they became enthusiastic. Sometimes this was very embarrassing to me. Often they celebrated me as a Nazi, asking whether I had helped to kill Jews, or one time even wanting me to read out loud from Hitler's Mein Kampf, which some of them kept in their houses as we might keep the Encyclopedia Britannica. One man took me with him to his mosque for prayer. I knelt down and bent my head to the ground like the others. Near Baalbek in Lebanon, I wanted to photograph some nomads I saw and made the mistake of walking into the desert towards their tent. 3 big dogs ran at me and pinned me down. It was noontime and extremely hot. Each time I tried to move, the dogs would bare their vicious teeth and move a little closer. The nomads did not call their dogs back for hours. My knees were shaking, and my fair skin was burning to a crisp. Finally, they whistled, and the dogs let me go back to my car. In beautiful, guest-friendly Lebanon, I met a family with a very beautiful 17-year-old daughter who fell in love with me. For 2 days, she hand-fed me the most delicious foods and made me feel incredibly comfortable and satisfied to be with her in these very romantic surroundings. It was all platonic, of course, but I was really sorry to leave her behind. She could have introduced me to a brand new life in Lebanon. I began to realize that I was like a chameleon. I could blend in anywhere to live with and like any of these different people I met, sharing their customs and food, meeting so many people in cities, villages, and fields in so many countries, drinking and eating what they did, observing their lives and trying to live with them for a while. I was able to see and touch a different kind of human being than I had known in Germany or the United States. I had seen so many wonderful things by this time that I felt the trip had already rewarded me richly. I had been especially impressed by Rome, Athens, and Istanbul, and part of the Middle East. I could not believe how much in each had survived from the distant past. In fact, all the ancient cities I visited on my way offered living lessons in history, teaching through all 5 senses lessons on how people lived their lives 2, 3, 4, even 5,000 years ago. It was a course of study far superior to anything one could get from books or history lessons. I began to regret not having brought Krista along. As I traveled, I thought about improving myself, making myself into a better man who could please her more. I missed her and could not wait to reach towns where a letter might be waiting for me. I filled more and more journal pages and kept sending them off to California. I had other concerns as well. I badly needed a carnet de passage to enter India with my car, and I was spending my money quicker than anticipated. I inquired at each town, but there were seldom letters from Krista waiting for me. I could imagine that having had to handle her father's death without support had put her into a tailspin, but I could not help her where I was, and I was determined to go through with this adventure. In Jordan, I tried to photograph some nomads who were cutting wheat they had sown in between the rocks. It was a beautiful sight. One could observe the whole process of harvesting in the traditional manner, cutting wheat with a sickle, threshing it out and separating the straw from the grain. But as soon as I approached with my camera, an older man came up to me, pulled his curved dagger, and pointed it at my throat. I felt the steel piercing my skin and blood running down my neck. I thought this was going to be my last moment. I stared into his fiery eyes and stayed as calm as I could. He demanded my shoes, slipped into them, walked back to his family, and continued throwing wheat up into the air to free it from the chaff. It took me 2 hours to bargain back my shoes. He did not want to give them up, but I needed them. They were the only ones I had. But after all, the experience of walking barefoot among the rocks, worried to death about my life and shoes whilst taking pictures of this beautiful, colorful family doing their age-old job, was a great one. I will never forget Jerusalem or Bethlehem. With almost no foreigners there, life in these old cities seemed much as it must have been 2,000 years ago. If I ever came close to believing in the Christian idea of God and His divine Son, it was in the old village of Jerusalem, among the weathered buildings, covered passageways, narrow paths and stairwells. I found myself reacting as a devout Christian might be expected to react. Jesus seemed somehow still alive here. He became as human for me as the men who were walking beside me in the streets with their donkeys. I traveled with images of these holy places for days, but they became partially obscured in Egypt when I saw and climbed the pyramids, and more so when I stood before the big temples at Luxor and Karnak and the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Confronting the sheer size of what people had been inspired to build was like a powerful blow, shaking up my almost atheistic way of thinking. In the whole universe, one cannot find another place like Egypt. Here, human respect for superior powers and the deep desire to be reborn had found its ultimate expression. Their monuments showed that the human imagination could conceive projects on even the largest scale. But viewed through the lens of modern rationalistic thought, these monuments also show how limited and ineffectual we humans will always be in our attempts to respond to questions and fears about the infinite, with finite creations. The train trip from Cairo to Luxor and back gave me a marvelous view of the Egyptian way of life, the fields and gardens, the many palmscapes, and the Nile, but it felt quite a bit like standing in a wind tunnel simulation of a sandstorm. Because of the heat, we had to keep the train windows open, even though the locomotive often stirred up large clouds of fine sand and dust and then pulled the train through them. After many hours on the train, I looked like the desert itself. I was very grateful to a friend I had met in Cairo for his gift of a large water jug made of unglazed clay. From then on, I always traveled with this vessel, which kept the water wonderfully cool by the evaporation on its outside surface. In Luxor, I lived through an incredible sandstorm. For about an hour, one could see no more than 2 or 3 feet ahead, as the grit-filled wind picked up everything in its way. Before the storm, I had difficulties walking on the shore of the Nile, because everybody seemed to have gone there in the morning to take care of his sanitary needs. No one seemed bothered that during the day a big market selling everything imaginable, including all kinds of foods, operated right next to this public toilet, or that after the storm everything that had dried up in the boiling sun was blown over everything else. But I loved everything I saw of Egypt, the Nile, the sand, the palm-filled landscapes, the nice people, and the history. It gave me an incredibly big high. I began to calm down after driving 2 days farther along my route through the boiling hot desert towards Baghdad. I found the desolation and peace of the desert just as grand as all the wonderful sights and people I had just seen in Egypt. I will never forget this 200-mile stretch of road with no gasoline stations and only 2 water holes. In 2 days I saw only 3 men. 2 were sitting on the road in the middle of a huge area of desert entirely covered with pitch-black stones. When I stopped at a water hole, I noticed the 3rd man in the distance, riding a camel. As he rode toward me, it was exactly what I later saw in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, only this man was not a Tuareg in black, but a Bedouin in white. When he came close, I stared at his unbelievably brown and wrinkled face and very dark eyes. When he reached me, he said, "Salam," made his camel go to its knees, climbed off, and led the animal to the partially algae-covered watering hole. The camel stepped into the murky water with its front feet and started to drink and piss at the same time. After his camel had finished drinking, the man himself bent to the water and drank from the same spot the camel had used, just pushing the surface algae aside with his hand. I felt like offering him some of my clean water, but he had already climbed back on his animal. He said, "Salam," and rode back in the same direction from which he had come. I watched him disappear in the overheated, scintillating air that in the distance looked like layers of water. I knew from my education in optics that this was an illusion, a mirage, but it was still magical. Then there was again complete silence, once precious silence. It was one of those rare and privileged moments when one can hear it, and I loved it with all my senses. Baghdad turned out to be the city of 1001 nights, with more of the fabled Orient of the Middle Ages visible than anywhere I'd seen before, even in the best movies. Everything was real and unaffected by Western culture, especially in the quarters close to the Great Mosque. All the women wore black robes and were deeply veiled. Some men, apparently from the country, rode their horses right into the restaurants. The hustle and bustle everywhere never ceased. When I walked into the Golden Mosque, one of the holiest places of Islam, guards recognized me as a Christian. They jumped me, beat on me, and dragged me through the dust to the outside. By crawling very fast on my hands and knees, I escaped the agitated, loudly yelling crowd. I was so disturbed and frightened that I started at once to drive towards Tehran. Getting there turned out to be harder than I'd expected. 30 kilometers outside Baghdad, several tanks blocked the road. In the distance, I could see aeroplanes bombing the Kurds. The soldiers would not let me pass. I decided to drive back a little bit and then went off the road. I then drove like a madman in a 20-mile arc through the desert and back onto the road to Iran. I was so afraid the aeroplanes would attack me that I drove full throttle, as fast as the Volkswagen would go, through the packed sand. I went finally through a very rough and isolated stretch of primitive road. After I finally slowed down a bit, I noticed a jeep approaching from behind, carrying 2 men in underwear. They turned out to be the Iranian border guards who had been sleeping on the job. They made me drive the 25 miles back to the border to get properly processed. We drank some bottles of soda together, and they let me go on. It was now August, with the desert temperature always above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and often climbing to 135. I could drink 20 bottles of soda a day, and all the water I could get down, and sometimes eat 20 ice creams as well, without ever going to the bathroom. All moisture went out through the skin. The air was so dry one could jump into water fully dressed and be dry 5 minutes after emerging. The steering wheel got so hot I could not touch it until I wrapped it with cloth. After driving another 70 miles through a forbidding landscape, I saw a building beside the road. I stopped and went in. It was full of tribesmen with dark, sharp-featured faces, colorful clothes, and turbans with fringe hanging down. I found I was still in Kurdish country, in a place so backward that some of the men had big clubs with spikes on them, like medieval weapons. I was thoroughly scared but made a hand sign for drinking water. A man went out with a tea can and brought some water from the creek. I waited 10 minutes and left without drinking it. About 20 minutes down the road, I got stopped by 2 men who looked like the ones in the inn. They had very old rifles, which they pointed at me. I picked up 2 apples, opened the door, and gave one to each man. They smiled, looked through the car, got in, and waved me to continue down the road. They got out of the car shortly before Hamadan and gestured me to drive on. I was relieved when I finally reached Hamadan, but this was not my day. As I was driving through the village, a 10-year-old boy coming from the bakery with a pile of flatbreads in his arms crossed the street and ran right into the side of my car. In 5 seconds I was surrounded by a yelling, gesticulating mob, some of whom tried to pull me out of my car. Fortunately, the police rescued me. I spent 3 days under protective custody in prison, eating delicious food and playing cards with the guards. On the 4th day, a judge sentenced me to a negotiated settlement of $10. The judge explained in perfect German that even though the accident was not my fault and the boy had not been hurt, he had to find me guilty, otherwise he could not live here anymore, since most people in the village were illiterate and did not understand the law. I drove on to Tehran. Since leaving Istanbul 2 months ago, I had not received any letters from Krista. I was really worried. I waited in Tehran for a few days, still nothing arrived. I drove on to the Caspian Sea. One day I parked at a very lonely beach and fell asleep by the shore. When I opened my eyes, very large birds were circling over me, and sometimes buzzing just meters over my face. They were giant eagles. When I sat up, I found myself surrounded by a large group of vultures. They were probably waiting for me to die. I was not scared because these birds would not hurt anything showing signs of life. I spent hours on this beach, watching the eagles soar. I thought it surprising that humans had not invented aeroplanes sooner. Even before the invention of an engine, they could have observed the best birds soaring, measured and weighed them, and built scale models of bamboo and papyrus. Imitating natural flight would have been so much easier than inventing the wheel. Nothing like a wheel existed in nature. I saw many camel caravans and camel stations on this stretch of road, which was covered with fist-sized split rocks. By this time, the fenders of my once spotless Volkswagen sedan, hammered by the rocks, were completely shot. I loved Mashhad. It had a lot of magic, but I could not stay too long, and, once again, there was no letter from Krista waiting for me, and I felt I was running out of time and money. My keenest dreams of adventure became reality in Afghanistan. I immediately loved its proud and friendly people, and the tiny shops on the village roads where everything was manufactured exactly as it had been for hundreds or even thousands of years. As in the Middle East, I was amazed at how unchanged most of the land was, even though people had been living there for tens of thousands of years. It made me think about my work. As an engineer, I was part of the forces working to change the Earth. What would people from industrialized areas do to alter this life and landscape? I felt that any changes imposed by the modern world would only be destructive to this very rugged and beautiful terrain, with its many twisters and sandstorms, unimproved roads, and almost non-existent bridges and deserted forts and settlements in the middle of nowhere. Somehow, the austere nature of the landscape and the precious, simple hospitality of its people seemed fundamentally linked to each other. I hardly minded being robbed a couple of times. Nearly everyone wore a gun anyway. Those guys just happened to point theirs at me. They took very little, and mainly wanted a ride for a few miles. In Afghanistan, I met quite a few Russians. More important, I met Mark Schmidt, who was also traveling towards India. We got along well and decided to continue the trip together. Mark was a medical student from Hamburg, with a wonderful, lively, positive style of living and presenting himself. He could also handle people very well. When he told me I was too rough and sometimes took things too seriously, I asked him how he could be like he was. His surprising answer was, I always try to behave as if I were close to orgasm, or had just had one. That explained it very well, and I have often thought of his remark and tried with varying success to act like him. When I reached Kabul, I was completely out of money. There was still no letter from Krista. Taking the only choice left to me, I drove into the middle of the bazaar, opened my sunroof, and started offering everything I had to the highest bidder in the quickly accumulating throng of people. Within 2 hours, all I had left was my suitcase, a rucksack, and my battered, dusty Volkswagen. The next day, I made the acquaintance of the announcer of the local radio station. He kindly agreed to announce the time and place my new Volkswagen could be purchased. I cleaned the car for 2 whole days without much success and managed to sell it for $350 more than I had paid for it. The Minister of Foreign Trade of Afghanistan, a friendly guy who spoke perfect German, and who turned out to be the only person in Afghanistan able to give me a release stamp in my passport permitting me to leave the country without the Volkswagen, bought it. Now I had enough money to make it back to the States, but unfortunately I had come down with amoebic dysentery and was too sick to travel. I decided to ship most of my remaining luggage back to California, so I could travel very light. For days I was hallucinating with very high fever. When I got somewhat better, Mark and I climbed onto the roof of one of the buses to Pakistan for an incredibly scary ride down the winding Khyber Pass Road. From our perch on the roof, we could see at every turn the burned-out hulks of buses that had fallen from the road into the deep gorge below. Our ride ended in Peshawar. Here, everybody walked around with a gun over his shoulder. The only quarters we could find were in a terribly primitive hotel. We paid less than $1 a night, but we had to shit somewhere on the roof into overflowing pots, while billions of flies covered every part of our bodies. My dysentery had returned, and I had to go back onto this foul roof every half hour, or the immense amounts of gas would have blown me apart. We were so desperate to get out of Peshawar that we traveled to Amritsar on the roof of a train. At least one could breathe up there. The inside of the train was jammed and stifling. The heat and humidity was so extreme that we took showers fully clothed every time the train stopped at a station. But Amritsar repaid us for the ride. It was like something out of a fable. Beautiful, exotic, and more comfortable than any place we'd been lately. The Sikhs there were kind, and we enjoyed being able to see women again. In all of Afghanistan, I had only seen 2, both completely covered from head to foot. We felt we had to see Kashmir. When we arrived in Srinagar, we were accosted by thousands of aggressive beggars. But it was a beautiful city, and there were lily-covered lakes with houseboats to live on. We rented one right away because I was now so sick I could no longer walk. For 2 weeks I lay in our houseboat with a high fever and truly terrible dysentery. I exhausted Mark's medical supplies. He kept telling me, I can't just give you the pills I think might help you. You have to have the will to live. Eventually, I recovered. While we were living on the houseboat, the local merchants came in boats to sell things to us. One was a shikar, a hunting guide, and we all agreed to go with him on a bear hunting expedition. 2 days on a bus and a lot of walking brought us to a tiny village 7,000 feet high in the Himalayas. It was raining like hell. After 2 days there, the shikar woke us up at around 3 a.m., telling us there are bears in the pear trees. This village had a problem with bears. The Indians had taken away all the guns owned by the Muslim villagers, so the bears were able to eat all their fruit without fear. I did not enjoy getting up in the middle of the night to solve their problem. It was pitch dark and cold, and I was very fearful. We had only one gun, which appeared to be a survivor of the Middle Ages. I was awarded the gun and the first shot, while the Shikar and Mark had axes as their only weapons. Shivering from cold and fear, we walked under each pear tree, shining a flashlight up into its branches, to spot a bear. This struck me as very dangerous, and I expected a bear to attack us at any second. Fortunately for us, we did not encounter any that night. The next day, farther up in the forest, I got a shot at a big brown bear. I fired from an unbelievable distance and hit him right in his rump, but he ran away. We searched for him for 3 days, climbing over rocks and through thickets, always with our one gun and 2 axes at the ready. By the end of the second day, the straw shoes of our guide and his friends from the village were so worn out that they went barefoot. Finally, we became too exhausted to continue. I promised each of the 3 tribesmen who had helped us search that I would send each a wristwatch if they could find the bear, skin it, tan it, and send it to me in California. When I got to Hong Kong, I bought 3 good-looking, functional wristwatches for a total of $5, just in case. 6 months later, I received a beautiful bear skin. I sent the watches as promised. 3 months later, I received a letter from my volunteers. They had walked for days to Srinagar, hired a scribe there, and dictated a letter to me. Their letter touched me more than any other I have ever received. It started out, "Your gracious grace, Sahib Johansmeyer, we received the watches you promised and will never in our lives forget." I cried like a dog, and their letter made me regret a little less having shot this innocent bear. After making a pilgrimage to that most beautiful of memorials to a beloved woman, the Taj Mahal in Agra, we arrived in New Delhi. A letter from Krista was waiting, the first in more than 3 months. There was no check inside, only a letter saying that she had given up our apartment, sold all our furniture, moved to Reno, Nevada, and filed for divorce. Mark had left for Germany from New Delhi. Now Krista's letter dropped me into a pit where there was nothing but pain. I loved this woman. Again and again I asked myself, why did you leave her at home? Why did you make this trip? Why didn't you return to her when her father died? But I had in me the urge to travel and the belief that by traveling, I could make up for the time lost while locked up in East Germany's prisons. Then, once I had begun my trip, my plan became an imperative, a mission, and I was too stubborn to abandon it. Now I had all the time in the world, no ballast, but no one to share it with. I could easily carry everything I owned: a toothbrush, a shirt, a pair of pants, a pair of Indian sandals, and a small bag on a string around my neck. Hidden under my shirt, the bag contained my only valuables, my passport and the money left from the sale of the car. I should have felt free of all the obligations, but I was bound to my emotions. Without an audience at home, my trip had lost some of its meaning for me. Krista's letter had made pointless all the plans I had made for what I wanted us to do together when I returned to California, and all the promises I had been making to myself about what I would be for her. What hurt me even more than actually losing Krista was my feeling, my certainty that I had failed as a human being with Krista. My dysentery came back, made worse by the incredible heat. Not knowing what else to do, I continued traveling through India by train, to places I picked almost at random. When I ran into 2 holy men traveling to Benares and Calcutta, I joined them. I still have a picture of the 3 of us standing in front of a beautiful temple. They are only skin and bones. All 3 of us have beards and have amulets around our necks. We look very much alike. My mother told me later that when my grandmother looked at this picture, she pointed to one of the holy men and exclaimed at how much weight I had lost. I had always thought of India as the most magical country in the world, a place where people made pilgrimages to find jewels of wisdom. I had imagined myself sitting under trees where great philosophers or religious leaders had once sat. In fact, I received no great revelations in India, heard no great words of wisdom, and had too little time to reach nirvana by living and thinking correctly. I did find wisdom of another kind by observing the country people I encountered in trains and villages. I saw how their close bonds with family and friends made their lives rich and fulfilling, even though they had lived at the edge of survival. My favorite place on the train was up in the luggage rack. There I could sleep or observe the overcrowded compartment below me. On these trains, people often traveled with everyone and everything that belonged to them: babies, flocks of elderly relatives, bundles of cloth, chickens, dogs, monkeys, and even pigs. It was a very colorful, ever-changing scene with terrible sanitary conditions. At every station I got off and took my shower to cool down. When the three of us reached the sacred city of Benares, I was too sick to see much or enjoy anything. From there I went on doggedly, by myself, and finally reached Calcutta. I began feeling a little better, but saw scenes of some of the utmost misery I have ever witnessed. People were dying on the streets, and vultures fed on the dead human flesh. Trucks came every morning to pick up the bodies. Anyone who did not move was tossed onto the trucks to be dumped I don't know where. I have never forgotten these scenes, from which I learned an important lesson. If you want to stay alive and not be thrown onto the truck, you have to keep moving. I felt miserable, both mentally and physically, and considered abandoning the rest of my trip and returning to California. But somebody had told me that after I reached Thailand, conditions would start to get better again, so I continued on to Bangkok, where I wanted very much to see the magic temples and the floating market. Suddenly, outside a little antique store, I became so weak that I collapsed. The owner, realizing I was very ill, brought me to his home, which was not far away. His family treated me like one of their own, taking care of me for several days while I lay bedridden with a high fever. Their beautiful 18-year-old daughter held on to me the way someone would hold on to a favorite dog. She fed me, washed me, petted me, and even slept near me at night. It was so completely natural that the family did not object. This family operated with an incredible sensitivity, serenity, and sense of pride, and was completely natural, uninhibited, free and pure. She taught me some Thai words, and I taught her the English ones I most liked to hear. After I recovered, I took on a trip through Thailand. I rented a long wooden boat that came equipped with a powerful motor on the back, and a tiny older man as a guide and steersman. We cruised along rivers and even crossed the ocean to remote temples, lone villages, and isolated beaches. We slept on little elevated platforms right under the sky and ate all kinds of native foods, mainly fruits, rice, fish, and lobsters. It was as close to paradise as I had ever come. I felt like an 18-year-old myself and thought I could stay there forever. My cash reserves were dwindling, however, and I had no way to earn money in Thailand. I had to get back and face reality. I said goodbye to and her wonderful, kind family with the honest promise to return. I really wanted to. 25 years passed before I returned to Thailand. When I went to the area where New's family had lived, everything had been redeveloped. All the buildings were new. I had too little time to locate New and her family, but I remember them with great gratitude and love. From Thailand, I flew to Hong Kong, Japan, and Hawaii, spending only a couple of days in each place. I thought then, and have thought more since, about what I gained from this trip. First, it gave me time to think about myself. As I traveled, I realized that I wanted to remake myself into a better person and to shake off all the remaining attitudes and suspicions left from my time in prison. My exposure to the world affected me as much as my introspection. During my trip, I enjoyed many periods where I was totally engrossed in the events unfolding, as one can be during a theatrical performance. I carry some of these moments within, like pictures taken with my camera, or the favorite poems and books that are a part of me. They have become important reference points in my essential self, additional mosaic stones that are part of the basis for my thinking and being. Toward the end of this trip, I had seen many places and scenes, and just being somewhere was no longer enough. I was only satisfied when I could feel I was almost part of the place where I was, not pushed to go on. For example, I hoped I could always remember the simple life full of love I had been able to live in Thailand. Before this trip, I had been a German living in America, seeing it through German eyes. The trip broke the cast of my national conditioning, making me able to see that the German way was neither the only way nor the right way. I began to be able to see European, American, and Asian countries differently, when I could look at each with the knowledge of the culture of the others. I found, however, that this new viewpoint of the world set me somewhat apart from most of the people with whom I worked then and later. The difference was, I realized, somewhat similar to the way living in prison society had left me unable to discuss life with people who had only seen it under much less extreme conditions. On my return to California, I had no place to stay. Krista had sold all our furniture, moved out of the apartment, and left. I found her later in Reno, Nevada, and we started a new love relationship. But the divorce proceedings continued until the final day when Krista waited at the court steps for my appearance or a message to cancel her divorce. But I chose not to show up. I realized we had different horizons and ambitions. I had not met any one great teacher or guru on my trip around the world, but this trip had nevertheless greatly expanded my mind. I had been in outer space, looking back at my own life on Earth. I wanted the doors to the upper floors of the world wide open. Nothing seemed impossible. And ultimately, I made many new inventions, started, built up, and sold companies, financed many new startups, found time to express myself with the new paintings I had imagined in Paris, married a beautiful, generous-thinking young woman, and even finally managed to buy the house of my dreams.